The limitation of eyes. Our doctrine of different eyes are such that unless we are able to note that we consist of many eyes, we cannot shift from where we are at present. Recall how different eyes arise in us, and what the work teaches on this subject, where it points out that we are born with essence alone. In small children, the manifestation of undeveloped essence can be observed. In, for example, the Gospels, where it notes that we should suffer unto little children. Essence comes down to this level, and incarnates into matter, so as to grow and develop. However, it cannot grow by itself, beyond a very nominal degree. Note here that small children do not exhibit negative emotions, which are defined by their persistence. A child grows up among sleeping people though, beginning to form personality at the onset which gradually surrounds essence. A small child never says I. When a child begins to say I, that is where imaginary I begins. Many I's in us are laid down through imitation, and a growing child begins to say I to all of them. It could be noted that it begins to say I through a kind of imitation, by imagining itself as I because it hears adults always saying I and identifies with that. Many other factors of course enter into development, such as conditioned responses, and identifying or external considering. This is I and that is you. Speaking as adults, we have inevitably and even by design acquired the wrong feeling of I. That is imaginary I. If essence is to develop in us beyond roughly the age of puberty, when it is finally induced to deep sleep by personality, then everything connected with imaginary I has to be rendered passive. It is understandable that unless one can divide themselves into two, they will be unable to shift from their psychological state. Dividing ourselves into two means to divide yourself into an observing side and an observed side. Unless an individual can observe themselves, they cannot change, and such a person remains always the same. As long as we take ourselves as one, a monism, as always being one and the same I, then we cannot change anything. This work has many things to say about lying, the deepest of which is that it destroys essence. A person who always lies destroys their own essence, which is the only part in us that can grow and develop further, raising us to another level of being, and so to a different fate and outcomes, to another position in the scale of being. A liar cannot grow. Each one of us has in them a great number of I's that lie, and these I's are always connected with the tremendous activity of self-justifying. We should be uncomfortable when we lie, and the work points out that there are two forms of lying: lying to others and lying to ourselves. At the same time, it notes that lying can only be defined by a relationship to some system of truth. If you have never been taught anything about what truth is, then it is difficult to see how you could lie. A small child that knows nothing does not lie and cannot lie, but when they are taught something they begin to lie with regard to what they have been taught, because we can only lie in connection with some truth. If you have never been taught any ideas of right or wrong, about truth and falsehood, then how exactly can you lie? As soon as humanity was capable of conceiving the idea of things forbidden and things allowed, they gained the capacity to lie. We can lie in this work, but lying about work destroys any possibility of development. We can both lie to other people, and then lie to ourselves. The center of gravity of this teaching on the matter of lying to oneself notes that this is possibly one of the most important things. However, it also begins by pointing out that we must not lie to our teacher. You may not wish to speak to your guide about something, but if you are asked to tell what happened, and you lie, which is always known, then you fall into a dangerous position, not only toward the work, but towards your inner possibilities of development. The system of this work is a clearly defined thing, and we know what it means to lie to the work. We may lie in life, but to lie to the work is quite a different matter, because we are then lying in reference to a definite system of truth. Any development of psychic life is only possible through a system of truth, which we then begin to follow. We have to begin to live this truth in practice, and not to merely think about it or talk about it as that is sophism. The work surrounds a definite system of teaching, of forms of truth which, if lived practically, can then lead us to a desirable path. This living of the truth of work means working on oneself. It means that we want to follow what the work teaches. However, if we lie to ourselves internally, as when one says they are not negative but really are, then you block the influences of any work in yourself. All development depends in the esoteric sense upon relating yourself to a system of teaching which does not lie in life. The work is something extra, it is a second education. An individual may be a naturally good person in their daily life, but this is not the idea of work, because the idea of all esotericism, including the Gospels, is to bring us face to face with an entirely different way of living life, so as to change our fate. It is only through an entirely different way of living and understanding that the aim of esoteric teaching on earth is fulfilled. Through social training, we may be taught not to express negative emotions publicly by reason of our upbringing, but this has nothing to do with work. We have to find an entirely different relationship to the whole idea of negative emotions, one that is not governed by external appearances. Internally, people who have learnt not to express their negative emotions in life may be infested with negative emotions. For this reason, it is important not to lie to oneself. P.D. Ouspensky said, "Lying destroys essence, because essence can only grow through truth. An individual must cease to deceive themselves before they can begin to grow." The worst form of lying is pretense, where everyone pretends to be what they are not, as the source of all lying of this kind lies in our imagination. Talking about life in general, Ouspensky said, "Nothing in life is what it pretends to be." At that time he was talking about the United Nations, saying, "It is not what it pretends to be, just as so many other apparently excellent organizations are not what they pretend to be." How can you expect sleeping people to create organizations far beyond their own level of being? Ouspensky felt the same way about the modern church, that a church does not do what it pretends to do, which is to make people as Christ. Gurdjieff said something similar about Christianity, that there was only one Christian, and they were called the Christ. Taking lying on a practical level, in particular that form of lying which begins with imaginary I becoming connected with false personality. We are told in a work parable that the human race on earth are likened unto sheep, under the charge of two shepherds who are magicians. These shepherds desire to prevent the sheep from escaping from their control, and being extremely frugal, they do not wish to use expensive methods of retaining these sheep, so instead hypnotize the sheep, telling them they are lions and eagles, in fact, superhuman. This is a parable about the power of imagination, connected with imaginary I, which eventually creates false personality. False personality is entirely pretense, made up of imagination, and has its origin within imaginary I. The misconception that we have a real I in us. With this form of imagination, which keeps us asleep as sheep, we gain the most extraordinary ideas about ourselves. We think that we can do, that we possess real will, can decide, and therefore determine our own lives, shape and form our own outcomes, simply by desiring it to be so. We can never accept that everything simply happens to us, even our own lives. We form in ourselves a kind of secret imagination, and although life itself does not correspond to this fantasy, we still cling to it, feeling that we are lions, eagles, superheroes, and even gods, never realizing what we are actually like. The delusion that we possess a solitary and unified I, that we are doing everything from ourselves, along with an inability to see that we are actually mechanical, that we are being done to, where everything simply happens to us, the non-realization of that imaginary I, and all of the fantasies built up through false personality, the inability to see where we really are, to see what our lives have been like. All this keeps us fast asleep in a continued state of self-deception and delusion. The pretense arising from a continued state of self-hypnosis. That state of being is described in another work parable as a driver sitting in a public house, spending all his money on drink, while the horse and carriage in which he can go somewhere real stand outside neglected. Remember, the parable notes the first step is to awaken the driver. What is that drink that the driver is drinking? It is the soma wine, and imagination about oneself, the belief that we only have ourselves to imbue, literally to see the strength of that imagination. What does everybody begin to do when they start drinking literally? They begin to boast or start by revealing their secret self-imagination, declaring how wonderful they truly are, how no one has appreciated them, and nobody understands them. Because everyone has that secret self-love connected with imaginary I and false personality, which constitutes one of the most hidden sources of making internal accounts and justifying. The first form of lying to study in ourselves, according to the work, is that we tend to talk about things that happened through the light of personal advantage. When you have to report what you said, and what the other person said in some work conversation, you will find that it is practically impossible to put the matter in its correct perspective. We all tend to reshape the narrative to our advantage, by leaving out some things that we said, and slightly overemphasizing other things that might have been done. Of course, there are those that do the same thing but the other way around, by deliberately putting themselves in a very bad light, displaying wretched self-pity, with hopes of some reward. People are inevitably certain they can speak the unbiased truth, both about themselves and other people. There are certainly more truthful eyes in us, and less truthful eyes. However, what is the whole object of being truthful in this work? It's not based on moral grounds but on the possible development of a thing called essence, that can never grow through pretense or falsehood. All those eyes that lie habitually, all those eyes that protect the central kingdom of our false personality, justifying every action, twisting every event and turning things to their own advantage. This all prevents the inner development of essence from taking place. For that reason, the work teaches that it is important to tell the truth to your guide and mentor, because through that exercise you learn how to tell the truth to yourself. If you cannot tell the truth to yourself, you cannot get beyond the sphere of your imaginary I and false personality, which can never lead to any form of inner development. So it is not a moral question but a practical one. If we begin to see more about the falsities of our past lives, then we begin to alter them in that past. We can observe and note lies from the past, but can only see them through work on ourselves in the present. If the observation of ourselves has now increased in the present moment, then we begin to see all sorts of fake attitudes, false intonations, imaginary ways of conceiving of our own value, false blaming and finger-pointing. We are mercifully able to see the same things functioning in the same way throughout our lives. We can change that past through this present moment of work, because life is a compact thing lying coiled up in ourselves, and when we die, we take that coiled up thing with us. We can often change the past more easily than the future, which is partly because when we begin to awaken a little more to what we are like, the past comes forward and enters into our conscious awareness, whereas an unknown future does not enter our awareness in quite the same way. Always in the future lie further temptations, but we are not tempted by the past in the same manner, except through habit. This work opens up our past in exactly the right way, when we have begun to lift ourselves into the present moment, to a level of work where we can see what our lying has been like in the past, and begin to understand that what is called lying in the work is not always what we thought. It may not be expressed by lying in words but by pretending, because a person can lie with a single gesture, a single look, a single intonation, a casual mannerism, a sigh, a heartbroken expression, an illness, or by displaying a hearty manner, by being always fit and well, always positive and cheerful, bright and uplifting. We all know how marvelously we have behaved, and we all know what intolerable conditions we have been subjected to. The work says we all lead an imaginary life within ourselves, and that infatuation of self-worth can take a great deal of strength from us, in all cases preventing any real self-observation. It has to be torn out at its roots because those self-emotions are tremendously powerful. Occasionally the self-love clustered around imaginary I can be sad or even tragic. We all know one another's hopeless looks. When we are immersed by that infatuation, it renders us weak, whether the self-worship is about being strong and cheerful, or misunderstood and never given a chance. It is all self-hypnotism, and always the deep source of making internal accounts, because we do not see the form of imagination which has such invisible power over us. We do not see the eyes that use that form of imagination, that give us a false center of gravity, making us completely misunderstand the significance of our lives, what happened previously, preventing any understanding of things as they truly were, or asking that terrible question in retrospect about why life for us has always been like this. After a time we may begin to acquire a work conscience which actually makes us very unhappy, not in the soul-destroying way of self-pity and pseudo-suffering, but in a much cleaner way. This is the beginning of that force that can help us to see our own lying. It's not an acquired life conscience from our upbringing, but the beginning of real conscience which can change life. It is the birth in us of something quite new, and though its action is very gentle, it is absolutely authentic, and we know and recognize its authority. This is the beginning of awakening from sleep, a conscience which knows nothing about our being an Englishman, an American or Chinese, whether rich or poor. It is the same in everybody once awakened, and has nothing to do with customs that have been acquired, the schools we went to, professions that we pursue, or the social positions that we hold. For it we do not exist as a personality. The work teaches that this real conscience, which is always the same, lies buried in everyone, and that the work awakens it eventually. A conscience that serves work on self, because it leads to contact with higher centers, but can never awaken as long as imaginary I and false personality, all the forms of lying connected with them, are dominant, because it leads in the direction of real I, which is totally above the level of imaginary I and false personality, along with all pretenses. Remember too that lying harms others in the work, and guard how you treat another in the shadows of your own mind.